So there's a bunch of terminology that I want you guys to look at and go through. And again, unless you've dealt with digital a lot, these may not be familiar terms to you. They definitely were not to me, but I would recommend going through those. And this again is chapter 25. So we skip back to the back, but I feel like we need to know about this sooner rather than later so that you understand how what's happening in that sensor when you're taking an image. Okay, so the terminology for this chapter is all at the very beginning on that very first page on page 288. An analog image is a radiographic image. That's what they call a film, like a film x-ray. They refer to that when we're talking digital as an analog image. And when we take that analog image and digitize it, that's where we're taking it and turning that film into an image that's made of pixels and stored in the computer rather than on a piece of film. Okay, so the bit depth image is the number of possible grayscale combinations for every pixel. So in film, we were talking about those silver halide crystals and how they kind of float around in that gelatin. On a sensor, we've got little pixels, just like you do in your television. And the more pixels, the clearer the image. And every little pixel has a different grayscale that could be assigned to it. And that's what gives us our different densities on a digital image. There are different types of sensors. There's the charged coupled device, which is just a solid state silicon chip that converts that light, X-ray photon into an electrical charge or signal that then gives those pixels their differing grayscale. And let's see, digital imaging we know is just filmless imaging. Digital subtraction is hold on. Digital subtraction is a method of reversing the grayscale. So depending on your software on your computer, like through Dexus, there's different things that you can do with your image. And digital subtraction is one of them, where rather than like the things that would normally appear dark now can appear light and vice versa. So you can kind of change the way you look at an image. Sometimes doctors like to do, specialists like to do that, to look at things in a little bit different way. Like I said, digitizing is converting that analog or film image into a digital form. We also touched on direct digital imaging when I was talking to you about the different types of image receptors. So direct digital is that intraoral sensor that is exposed and it captures an image and can be viewed immediately on your computer. So that's like what we do, where we use the corded sensor, and as soon as we take it, within a matter of seconds, it's on our screen. Indirect are those PSP plates that have to be scanned after they've been exposed to X-ray. So you have to run them through the scanner, and then they're converted to a digital image on the computer that way. They take a little bit longer. The PSP plates can also be damaged by a patient biting on them because they're very much like film. They're reusable. We have to erase them. I think a lot of the scanners now will scan and erase all in one step, but we used to have to scan ours in, wait for them to be scanned and drop out of the scanning machine, and then we would lay them on, again, it looked like a little tanning bed, it was light, and we would lay them on there, and you'd close the lid and set it for a certain amount of time so that it would erase the image that had been captured on those phosphor crystals, and then we would put them in a new sleeve. Phosphor plates are difficult because it's you have to follow manufacturer's directions on disinfection. You have to be really careful what you use on them because you could mess up the surface, and so that could affect their ability to obtain an image. So the sensor with the cord is ideal because it's direct, it's fast, it's easy to disinfect. You can just wipe it down. You don't have to replace it unless you have dead pixels, if it gets dropped, if it gets broken. The bad thing is direct sensors are far more expensive than PSP plates. So that's kind of why I think a lot of doctors opted to go for PSP plates from film. The line pairs per millimeter is a term that's used to measure and evaluate the ability of that computer to capture resolution of an image. And then the pixel, like I said, is that discrete little unit of information or gray scale. The sensor is just the receptor that we're going to use for this. And the storage phosphor imaging is an image that is recorded on those phosphor-coated plates and then placed into that scanner or electronic processor. So the purpose of digital is the very same as film. We're just doing it in a little bit nicer, more convenient way. We're going to generate an image that's going to be used to diagnose or assess dental disease in our patients. We can detect lesions, diseases such as periodontal disease, decay, and conditions of the teeth and surrounding structures. We can confirm or classify a suspected area of disease with x-rays. They can be used for localization of specific lesions or foreign objects that maybe have broken off in the gum line or the floor of the mouth. And it can provide very important information during dental procedures, whether that be a root canal or an extraction. Doctors will use x-rays throughout those procedures to kind of see where they are. They're important for evaluating growth and development. They can illustrate changes that can happen due to caries or perio disease or even trauma. And it's nice to document the condition of a patient at a specific point in time. So let's say you have a new patient that comes in and they had a full set of x-rays, but it's been maybe a couple of years. So we're going to get some bite wings today. We should still, if possible, reach out to their previous provider and get their previous x-rays. It's so nice to have that to compare. Look back and say, hey, in 2018, this is where we were with this tooth, and today let's look at how the decay has progressed. I think it's probably time we do something. It's nice to be able to educate your patients and show them the differences, whether that be something getting worse or something getting better, but it's nice to have that point of reference. They also aid in the development of our treatment plan. So if we're trying to create a treatment plan, whether that be like periodontal therapy or even decay, if the doctor's sitting down with the patient and they've got a lot of areas that need restoration, maybe it's a filling, maybe it's a crown, they can create their treatment plan by kind of deciding which areas should be treated first, how severe, etc. So the fundamentals of digital imaging is we use a sensor. It breaks information into those little electronic pieces and presents and stores the image using a computer. The image is then used to describe what we call, we called them radiographs before. Now we're going to call them images because we're using digital. The sensor is placed inside of the mouth, so it is our intraoral receptor, and then the signal is digitized. The nice thing about digital imaging, the most important thing, is it requires less X-radiation exposure than film did to our patients. It is far more sensitive to X-rays, and so therefore, if used properly, if exposure techniques are set correctly, the exposure time using a digital sensor is 50 to 90% less than what we used in conventional film radiography. The equipment is the same. You don't have to change your X-ray unit. You can still use the same wall unit. You can use a Nomad. Any X-ray unit is fine. The sensor is new, and you must have a computer, and that computer needs to be current. It needs to be up to date in order to handle the software that's necessary to use the sensors. The different types of sensors are the charged coupled device or the complementary metal oxide semiconductor. We use a CCD in our clinic. And this is just all of the equipment. There's your computer screen and there's your sensor. That's basically our equipment that we have in our clinic. As far as the X-ray unit, like I said, most digital systems just use a conventional dental X-ray unit as its source of radiation. The X-ray unit timer must be adapted for digital. We can see that in that one X-ray room that has our older wall unit by your locker room. If you don't change that exposure to digital, which is the picture of the computer, it is quite a bit more radiation being fired at your patient. So you always want to make sure in that room, the other ones are already set for digital, but that room in particular, you have to make sure that you change that to digital. And you guys have seen this picture lots. That's just an X-ray unit, a wall unit. Sensors can be wired or wireless. Obvious, it has a wire or it doesn't. That wire is linked by a fiber optic cable that connects that sensor to the computer. And that's what we use. That's what most offices use. And I think wireless is just kind of scary because it could be easily dropped. It could be easily lost. So I think most offices that use direct digital use a wired sensor. The most popular types of direct sensor are the charge coupled device like we have or that complementary metal oxide semiconductor. Both of them are rigid solid state detectors and they're both made of silicon. This is just showing the sheath. Very similar to the ones we use. You always want to place a sheath over the sensor and a lot of the wire. And really that's most of the wire that you would be touching while you're moving this around in the patient's mouth. The CCD is the most common image receptor that is used in digital. It is, again, a solid state detector containing that silicon chip with an electronic current. The electrons that make up the CCD appear divided into blocks or little picture elements known as pixels. And this is an example of what pixels are. They are little small boxes or wells where those electrons produced by the X-ray exposure are deposited. And like I said, they're comparable to the silver crystals that we have on film. The complementary metal oxide semiconductor, again, a silicon chip. It's less expensive to produce. It offers greater durability than the CCD. It has a smaller pixel size, lower power requirements. It can be connected to a computer using a low power external connection such as a USB. So it's very similar. They're both very similar. The computer is used to store that incoming electronic signal. So basically, it's going to convert that electronic signal from our sensor into different shades of gray that we can view on that monitor. And it will digitize, process, and store that information that it receives from the sensor. And usually it takes about a half of a second to 120 seconds for the image to appear. Sometimes it seems like forever when you're sitting there waiting to make sure you got the image you wanted, but it comes up pretty quickly and has split screen and magnification capabilities. I will show you guys when we're in clinic. There's lots of little fun tools across the top of your DEXIS that allow you to magnify or reverse the grayscale like we were talking about, or hone in and like blow up just the interproximal areas. So digital has really aided our ability to diagnose and really be able to see things as they're just beginning, which for decay is wonderful because we have found that if we use some of the remineralizing products that are out there, like Enamelon, and I think there's one called Remen, that contain phosphor and calcium and fluoride, if we can catch those decay starts at that incipient point where it's just beginning and it hasn't broken through the enamel, you can remineralize those areas and those may never have to be filled. So that is a huge benefit of digital, is it allows us to really see things close up and personal. Again, just what we see on our computer screen. And you can see across the top of that DEXA screen, all of those little buttons, and all of those little buttons enable you to do something different. And we're going to play with those in clinic. There's direct and indirect, which we've already touched on. I won't go through that again. Just direct is the sensor. You see the image right away. Indirect is going to be those PSP plates that require a scanner, and then they must be erased and they are reused. And here is what those indirect PSP plates look like. And you can see over to the right of this image, the operator is placing that number 2 phosphor plate into a scanner, which will then be connected to the computer and digitize that image. Like I said, the thing with those plates is they are flexible, which can be nice. They can be more comfortable for the patient, but they can be easily bent and easily scratched. And when they're scratched, then you've got to, on every single image you take with that, it's going to affect that image. So it's not, the flexibility is nice for comfort, but it's not good for the life of the PSP plate. It is important to follow the manufacturer's provided book for your specific operating system. Like I said, it's important that those X-ray units are set up properly and the exposure factors are correct. Not just leaving it what it was for film, but actually reducing that exposure to the patient and making sure that you're setting it for a child if it's a child, making sure you're setting it for digital if it's digital. All those things need to be followed. Making sure that we are disinfecting our sensors, that we're covering them with those waterproof barriers. Remember that a sensor can never, ever, ever be sterilized. I had a student, and that's why I always say I never want to see those sensors back in the sterilizing area. I had a student that I caught like putting the sensor in a bag to go in the autoclave, and I about had a heart attack. So since that happened, that was my bad because I didn't make that super, super clear. So I make sure that I make it super, super clear because like I told you, those are very expensive little sensors. And if you put them into the autoclave, they're done. They're held in the mouth by the bite block attachments, or those XCP beam aiming devices. And we're always going to opt for the paralleling technique if possible. There are going to be those patients that we cannot use that, and we're going to have to find some other way to possibly hold the sensor in the mouth, or we're going to have to bisect that angle and kind of eyeball the image. But for most cases, the paralleling technique can be used. The advantages of digital over film, there's so many. There is a superior grayscale resolution. So in digital, we have up to 256 different colors of gray that can be shown. 0 is black and 255 is a number that's assigned to white. And then there's all those grays in between. So we have a huge grayscale. Conventional film used 16 to 25 shades of gray, so far less. There's an extreme, like I said, 50 to 90% reduction in radiation exposure. And the increased speed of viewing images is probably one of the biggest pluses, and the fact that we can send those images by email directly to another specialist, another dentist, whatever the case may be. Advantages, some disadvantages are the cost. Obviously, the cost is huge, but We no longer have to have a processor. We no longer have to purchase film all the time. We don't have to deal with the chemicals. And when you had the chemicals as well as the lead foil, all of that stuff had to be disposed of properly. You couldn't just like pour it down the sink or throw it in the trash. So there's a cost associated with the disposal fees. It is incredibly efficient. It is enhancement of diagnosis and patient education. You can pull them up for the patient on the screen. You can put it up on a TV monitor. You can blow it up huge so they can see exactly what you're talking about. So there's lots of advantages to digital. The disadvantages are the initial setup cost. Image quality at one time was thought not to be as good, but that's not the case anymore because the image quality in today's digital is far better. It's really, really good. The sensor size and thickness. A lot of people claimed that because the sensor is not flexible at all, that it was sometimes more uncomfortable for the patient. I have not found that. It's not as sharp. The edges of film, granted, we used double packets in our clinic before we switched to digital, so they were really stiff and really sharp, and it was very uncomfortable for patients. But I don't have too much problem with the sensor being uncomfortable for patients. The sensor, and I'll go over this in clinic and lab when we're working, the sensor is slightly smaller than a film, than a number 2 film. So it is just a little bit smaller. So sometimes when we're taking images, we have to bear that in mind, that it's not going to give us quite as much information as a true number 2 size film will. Also, our sensor has clipped corners. And when you pull up an image, all of your images are going to look like old time pictures where they put those little black corners on the films. That's what all of our images look like. And it's not a cone cut. A cone cut would be white, and it's nothing that you've done wrong. That is just where the pixels end in our sensor. It has rounded corners. So I'll show you that in clinic as well. Infection control is probably a really big part of, could be considered a disadvantage because you can't, with film, everybody had a new piece of film. So now you have to make sure that you use those sensor covers, and you have to make sure that you disinfect them thoroughly between each use. And we try to keep them in their own little boxes, and I wipe out and disinfect the box as well. And let's see. With PSP plates, the wear and tear, those have to be replaced. With sensors like we use, if you drop them, that's why I have those little clips to clip them either to the patient or the lead apron, so that if you do drop a sensor, it only goes so far, it won't hit the floor. You can cause what's called dead pixels, and we have one in our clinic that we were using for practice, but in every single image it had like a white dot, and that was just an area where it was a dead pixel. It would no longer receive the energy from the x-ray, and it was just a white dot on every single image. So we want to make sure we don't ruin our sensors by dropping them. If you do drop, whether it be the Nomad or a sensor or whatever, I know that it's probably going to be the last thing you want to do is to come tell me or to tell Director Beckerly or one of us, but please do, because we have warranties on those things, and we can send them to be repaired or to be exchanged for a new one. And we don't want to keep using those on patients because that could mean retakes. If I'm using a unit that is broken, if it's a Nomad, it could be firing radiation out at everybody in the room. If it's a sensor, it could require me to take retakes every time I use that sensor. So if you would drop, please be honest and come and tell us. Another disadvantage with digital images is they've caused some legal issues, because you can take that image and enhance it with all of these different software applications. sometimes it's questionable whether it could be used as evidence in court or not. So if a patient is trying to declare negligence against a doctor and the images have been enhanced in some way, that wouldn't be very effective. So that's another thing with digital. Here are some different film holding devices that are aids that we have. And I do have all of these in clinic. We've got that snap array, which is the blue and gray up top. And in image A, it's holding that sensor for an anterior image. And in B, it's holding it for a posterior. You'll see when we work with those that because our sensor has a bump on the back where the cord is, those do not work as great as they look like they would. A lot of times your sensor will pop right out of there. Bite wing tabs, we have this particular type that wrap around the sensor cord. The problem with those is when you have that sheath on there, I have trouble getting them to stay stuck to that sheath. So that can be a problem, but you can do typical bite wings with just eyeballing it with the bite wing tabs if a patient can't handle the XCP. And then of course there's the XCP like we use that you guys have already gotten an opportunity to play with. And that is it for chapter 25.